All right, so we're back, and you guys have given us a ton to think about with this one. This time, we're diving deep into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But not just the surface stuff. It seems like you're really interested in the bigger picture stuff, peace plans, how those plans are shaping up, and how Russia's economy is factoring into it all.
Yeah, and especially that whole thing with Russia rejecting a peace offer from Trump before he even officially made one.
It's wild, right? Like they were rejecting something that wasn't even on the table yet. So the main source we're looking at is a YouTube video that breaks down some expert commentary. It gets into the current state of the war, potential paths to peace, and just how unstable Russia's economy actually is.
And this whole preemptive rejection thing from Russia just raises so many questions. Like, why would they do that? What does it tell us about what they're really trying to do?
Yeah, it seems almost counterproductive on the surface. But the video suggests that maybe one reason is their strong dislike for General Keith Kellogg, the guy Trump chose as his envoy for this whole conflict.
And their dislike for Kellogg isn't exactly a secret. I mean, he's been very vocal in his criticism of Putin, especially when it comes to the nuclear threats. Kellogg's position is basically that Putin wouldn't actually risk a nuclear war. He says that China and India have essentially made it clear to Putin that that's not an option.
Wow, that's a pretty strong stance to take. We actually have a clip of General Kellogg himself talking about his views on Putin and the whole World War III thing. Let's take a listen.
This should be interesting.
He doesn't really hold back, does he? It's really fascinating to hear his take on it all.
It's also interesting how much his analysis actually lines up with some things we've talked about on previous deep dives. It just goes to show how important it is to think critically about all of this and to consider all the different perspectives, especially with a conflict as complex as this one.
Totally agree. It's a good reminder to look beyond the headlines. And speaking of things that need a closer look, the Russian economy is in a pretty rough spot. We're talking crazy inflation, interest rates that are higher than Ukraine's, even stories of stores having to lock up butter to stop people from stealing it.
It's really a glimpse into the daily struggles that ordinary Russians are facing right now. Even basic foods have become super expensive, the housing market is a mess, and mortgage interest rates are just making things so much harder for people trying to own a home.
To break down this whole economic situation even further, we have a clip from economist Jason J. Smart. Let's hear what he has to say.
He always has a good perspective on this kind of stuff.
That's pretty bleak. It sounds like things are really tough over there. And to make things even more complicated, there's this Financial Times article about Russian tycoon Konstantin Malofeev. He outlines what Russia might be looking for in a peace plan from their point of view.
And some of these conditions are pretty eye-opening, to say the least. First off, they're demanding that the West stop supporting Ukraine completely, including all those arms shipments. And secondly, they want territorial concessions from Ukraine, which basically means Ukraine would have to officially give up those 4 regions that Russia is occupying.
Yeah, I don't see Ukraine agreeing to that. It would go against their constitution, wouldn't it?
You're absolutely right. Those first 2 conditions alone seem like deal breakers. But it doesn't end there. Their third demand is for direct, high-level negotiations between Putin and Trump. And they're not just talking about ending the war, they want to use this to establish a whole new world order, like completely reshaping global security, the balance of power, even things like the Middle East and relations between Russia and China.
So basically redrawing the entire global map. That's a pretty hefty wish list they've got there.
Uh-huh.
I'm guessing lifting the sanctions is on there too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The fourth condition is for all those Western sanctions to be completely lifted. And just to add to that, their fifth demand is for everyone to acknowledge Russia's dominant position in global affairs. Their words, not mine.
Sounds a little arrogant, to say the least. What's the last one?
The sixth condition is for a new global framework for peace and security. And surprise, surprise, it heavily favors their interests.
It's like they're holding the world hostage with these demands. And of course, Malafiev makes sure to remind everyone about Russia's nuclear weapons if these demands aren't met. That seems to be their go-to move.
It is, but here's the thing. If we think about all the economic turmoil happening inside Russia, it's possible that their internal problems might actually push them to find a resolution sooner than their demands might suggest. They might be putting on a show of strength, but the reality on the ground tells a different story.
Exactly. They haven't really gained much territory despite all the posturing. Their military losses are piling up, and their economy is incredibly vulnerable.
It all adds up to a strategy that just doesn't seem sustainable in the long run. And this brings us to a crucial point. How stable is Putin's regime, really? I mean, we've seen dictatorships crumble under similar pressures throughout history. It's something we have to consider, that we might be witnessing the beginning of a power shift inside Russia. And it could happen a lot faster than anyone expects.
Yeah, it really is a lot to unpack, isn't it? So many different factors at play, and it's hard to predict how it's all going to shake out.
Seriously, it makes your head spin a little. We go from talking about potential peace plans to, like, the possibility of a whole regime change in Russia. It makes you wonder, what happens if Putin actually does lose his grip on power? What does that mean for the war, for global stability, for us? Those are the million-dollar questions that everyone's trying to figure out. The ripple effects could be huge, and we need to be ready for anything, really. But going back to those peace conditions Russia's laying out, it just feels like they're trying to dictate terms from a position of weakness, telling Ukraine to just give up territory and stop defending themselves. That's not really a peace offer, is it?
Yeah, it feels more like they're trying to force a win when they haven't actually won anything on the battlefield.
Hmm.
And all this talk about nuclear war, could that be a way to cover up their weaknesses and scare everyone into giving them what they want?
It's definitely possible they're trying to shift the focus away from their struggles and create this sense of urgency, hoping that the West will just cave under pressure.
And if we go back to that comment about rejecting anything Kellogg might propose, it's almost like they're trying to shut down any chance of negotiations before they even start.
There's definitely an element of that, I think. By publicly dismissing Kellogg, and by extension, the U.S., they're signaling that they're not interested in compromise. It's all about controlling the narrative.
But let's be real. They need those sanctions lifted, like yesterday. Their economy is hanging by a thread at this point. That Financial Times article really paints a grim picture of what it's like for everyday Russians right now. People struggling to afford basic groceries, the housing market in free fall, mortgages becoming impossible to manage.
And that's just scratching the surface. The ruble is tanking, inflation is out of control, their budget is based on oil prices that are way too optimistic. It's a recipe for a disaster.
It's almost surreal to think about them locking up butter in stores. Like, people are so desperate that they're resorting to stealing basic necessities.
It sounds crazy, but these small incidents are actually really symbolic. They show just how bad the economic situation is and how much social unrest is bubbling under the surface. When people are stealing food to survive, things are seriously messed up.
It makes you wonder how long they can keep up this act, this whole we're strong and in control thing. Remember what that economist Jason Smart said about how this whole economic mess could actually backfire on Putin?
Yeah, he was saying that all this economic pressure could trigger a chain reaction, leading to social unrest, more soldiers deserting, and ultimately a challenge to Putin's authority.
And he even compared it to other dictatorships in history that seemed untouchable. But then they just collapsed overnight because of similar internal pressures. Could that happen to Putin?
It's definitely a possibility. When a regime loses its legitimacy because of a failing economy, military setbacks, and growing discontent among the people, it becomes much more vulnerable to internal challenges. It's not a question of if, but when.
So we've got this potentially explosive situation brewing, a failing economy, a war that's not going their way, and a leader whose grip on power might be weaker than he's letting on.
And on top of all that, we have escalating nuclear threats and this slim hope for peace negotiations. It's a volatile mix that could completely reshape the world as we know it.
It's definitely a lot to take in, so let's step back for a second and try to summarize the key points we've covered so far. So it sounds like we're looking at a really complicated situation here in Ukraine. Russia's pushing for a peace deal, but their demands are pretty extreme, and their economy is in shambles. And over it all is Putin, maybe not as firmly in control as he wants everyone to think.
From those clips we played, you can really feel the tension building in Russia. People are feeling the economic pain and starting to question Putin's leadership, the direction he's taking things.
That Financial Times article really drove that home, didn't it? It's not just numbers on a screen, it's real people struggling to buy food, keep their homes, hold on to their savings.
And when people are struggling like that, it creates a breeding ground for unrest, for instability. If the government isn't meeting their needs, people get less tolerant, they start to look for change.
Right, and from the start, Russia's whole strategy has been about projecting this image of strength, of dominance. But when you look at what's actually happening, it's a totally different story. They
Yeah.
haven't made much progress in Ukraine, they're losing a lot of soldiers, and their economy is on the brink.
They're not as powerful as they're trying to appear. And the fact that they keep using nuclear threats as a bargaining chip, it just shows how desperate they are. They're trying to compensate for their weaknesses by ramping up the rhetoric, hoping it'll scare the West into backing down.
But even if they somehow manage to get a ceasefire or some kind of agreement using these tactics, it's not going to fix the underlying issues, is it?
Exactly. A peace deal doesn't magically heal a broken economy or make all that social unrest disappear. And it definitely doesn't guarantee that Putin will stay in power long term.
So many questions still hanging in the air. Like, what happens if Putin's regime actually does collapse? What does that mean for the war, for the balance of power globally, and what does it mean for all of us individually?
These are questions we all need to be thinking about. It's a fluid situation, very unpredictable, and the consequences could be huge. It really highlights how interconnected our world is, how events happening far away can have ripple effects that reach us all.
It's a reminder that we need to stay informed, engaged with these global issues, even if they seem far removed from our daily lives. It's about connecting the dots, understanding how seemingly isolated events can have global implications.
Knowing what's going on is so important, especially in times like these, times of uncertainty and change. By staying informed, asking questions, and having these discussions, we can empower ourselves to navigate this complex world.
So keep digging deeper. Keep asking those tough questions. Keep the conversation going. And if you want to stay in the loop on future deep dives into these important world events, make sure you subscribe, like, and leave us a comment. We'll keep bringing you the insights and analysis you need to make sense of it all. Until next time,